These are the revisions to the coke oven rule, and this public comment period will be for 60 days. The reason for that is because this is a significant rule change. And the fact that this public comment period will also be taking place over the holiday season. So we want to provide an appropriate opportunity for stakeholders to be able to comment on this rule. The board has been provided the full rule change with the strikeout underline version, as well as the technical support document that gives a lot of detail about the purpose for this rule change. After this rule goes to public comment, and again, it's for public comment, it's not for approval of this rule. Once it goes to public comment, when we receive the comments, we will prepare a comment response document, and we may make changes as necessary to the regulation. After that process happens, we will bring this rule back to the Board of Health for a final vote for approval. And once that vote happens, the rule will be forwarded to the County Council for their vote for a final approval. So what we're going to do here, this is going to be a two-part presentation. Jeff Bailey, an assistant solicitor, is going to give the first part of the presentation. He's going to give you an overview and explain the process that we took to make these rule changes, as well as the department's reasoning for that. After he completes his presentation, he's going to hand that over to Dean DeLuca. He's the co-manager of the program manager of the air quality program. He's going to explain and go into some detail about several of the significant changes. He can't go into detail of all the changes because we don't have enough hours in this week to do that. But he will go into those significant and controversial changes, and he'll give a lot of detail about that as well. And so with that, I'm going to turn this over to Assistant Solicitor Jeff Bailey to begin this presentation.
Thank you, Jim. Next slide. Before discussing the regulation changes, we wanted to briefly explain the coke making process to help provide some context for the regulation changes. So briefly here, during the coke making process, coal is baked in the absence of air in a coke ovens at about 2000 degrees Fahrenheit. A battery consists of multiple ovens. If you can imagine a loaf of bread on its side where each slice is an oven, and US Steel has 10 batteries. And coke oven gas is produced during the coking process when volatile products and gases are driven off from the coal. The volatile products and gases include benzene, tar, sulfur compounds, which hydrogen sulfide being probably the most commonly known of those, ammonia, methane, and methane. Coke oven gas is then burned to heat the coke ovens, boilers, and blast furnaces. Next slide, please. This is a simple diagram of a coke battery to help illustrate how coke is made, and you can see the loaf of bread design. Coal is first loaded in a movable car that sits on the top of the battery called a Larry car. You can see it in the picture. The holes you see are ports that are open, and the Larry car is moved to each port, and the coal funnels down into the oven. The filling of the oven with coal is referred to as charging, and the charging emissions you see there. Once the charging is completed, the ovens are heated and the coke process starts. During the coking, our inspectors will walk along the battery and observe doors on each of the ovens for emissions. Once the coking process is completed, the doors are removed and the coke is pushed into a car using the pusher ram, which is shown in that diagram there. The car is then moved by rail to a quench station where water is put on the hot coke to stop the coking process. Next slide. Now I wanted to discuss the ACD's process for the coke oven regulation amendments. The regulation amendments presented today are the culmination of several years of work performed by the Air Quality Program in determining appropriate inspection procedures and requirements for coke ovens in Allegheny County. You have heard comments today that the ACD's process was not done properly or that we did not provide much consideration for the proposed change. I want to recognize that there were 11 engineers and inspectors staff from the Air Quality Program who spent countless hours in assisting in the development of the regulation changes. This includes meetings and discussions with coke engineers and inspectors who perform 6,000 inspections a year at the US Steel facility. This significant experience was invaluable in this regulation amendment process. Now, the ACD air quality staff also made themselves available to meet 11 times with the US Steel since June alone. I want to note that these meetings with US Steel did result in changes to earlier drafts of the regulation. Now, the ACHD is prepared to move these regulations forward for a public comment period. We also presented the amendments to the Air Quality Regulations Subcommittee on 2 occasions at 2 of their meetings and prepared a very detailed technical support document, which is attached at the end of the regulations, which explains the ACHD's basis for the amendments. Now, finally, the Air Advisory Committee voted 5-4 in favor of recommendation to the board for public comment. And I wanted to note that there were 2 members of the Air Advisory that submitted comments, and copies of those comments were provided to the board in your packet. Next slide, please. Now, the changes to the regulations could be grouped into 4 categories. I'll explain in more detail the first 3 in the later slides. I just want to briefly mention number 4 on the list is to remove outdated language, such as removing batteries that are not in operation, removing reference to Shenango, and you also see the reference to U.S. Steel, their full name versus just referring to me as USX. Next slide, please. The first reason for the change is to incorporate coke oven inspection procedures into the regulation. Now, the regulations currently only include the emission standards for coke ovens. The procedures for how to determine compliance with the standards are in a separate document called the ACHD Source Testing Manual. That source testing manual was last updated in 2010. Now, in 2019, the ACHD entered into a settlement agreement with U.S. Steel in which the ACHD agreed to include into the regulations the inspection procedures for coke ovens. Now, during this regulatory process, the ACHD reviewed and made changes to the 2010 inspection procedures that related to coke ovens. The inspection procedures were incorporated into the regulations and, as you'll see, will make up the vast majority of the changes that are in the draft regulations. And we believe that having the inspection procedures and the emission standards in one document makes the compliance requirements clear to not only our inspectors, but also to U.S. Steel. Now, the settlement agreement also provided that when we promulgated inspection procedures, that we would consider averaging for reading opacity, positioning of inspectors, and record keeping. Now, you've heard a representative from U.S. Steel reference this language in his comments today to imply that the ACHD was required to implement these factors in the regulation. I want to note here that the agreement only required the ACHD to consider these factors. And I want to emphasize also that the ACHD did consider, our engineers and inspectors did consider these factors and made changes to the regulations and procedures when appropriate. And Dean DeLuca will be able to provide more explanation on how we considered these factors. Next slide, please. Now, this is another illustration that shows all the potential emissions that are inspected by ACHD inspectors. I know the print is a little small there, but those are all the sections of the regulations. And the proposed regulations will now include not only the emission standards, but also the procedures for performing those inspections. Next slide, please. The second purpose for the regulation change is to address issues of stringency with federal and Pennsylvania regulations. The ACHD regulations cannot be less stringent than the EPA and the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection regulations. During this regulation review process, the ACHD determined that some provisions of the regulations were less stringent, and we are proposing amendments to address this issue. Now, the technical support document that is attached at the end of the regulations identifies the specific sections that we changed based on these stringency issues. Now, I would like to briefly address one of the U.S. Steel's comments. The settlement agreement that we have with U.S. Steel from 2019 provides that the ACHD will adopt more stringent emission standards that are technically feasible. Now, as you've heard, it's U.S. Steel's position that we are making regulations more stringent, but have not established whether they are technically feasible. First, I would like to note that the only emission standards that we are proposing to amend pertain to the coke oven gas, and I will explain later the basis for these changes. Again, I want to emphasize, we are not proposing, other than for the coke oven gas, we are not proposing to amend any other emission standards, in which what the settlement agreement references. The ACHD is only proposing to change the process for determining compliance with those standards. Second, we are obligated to make changes to the provisions of Article 21 that are less stringent than the EPA and DEP regulations. We are not required to determine if technically feasible before making those changes for that reason. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, I had in the technical support document, we went through all the different sections that were changed based on stringency. I just want to provide a couple of examples here on changes we made based on stringency. Now, as I previously mentioned on one of the first slides there, charging is when the coal is loaded into the oven. Now, EPA regulations include emissions for open standpipes as charging emissions. They include the emissions when it's coming from an open standpipe as charging emissions. Under our current ACHD regulations, inspectors would not consider emissions from an open standpipe as charging emissions. So that is an example of a section we are proposing to change so that open standpipes will be included in our definition so that our regulation is not less stringent than the EPA. Next slide, please. This is an example of how the stringency issues with the Pennsylvania regulations. Now, during the process where coke is pushed from the oven, which goes into quench carts, which I showed in that one chart and in that one illustration, the Pennsylvania DEP regulations provide for additional requirements for emission controls during that process. Our Article 20 regulations do not include these requirements. So we are proposing to add this language so that the Article 21 regulations are not less stringent than the DEP. I want to also note that for each of these examples that I just showed you, as you could see, the ACHG is not actually changing the emission standards, but we're addressing how the compliance with those existing standards are determined. The third change relates to correction in how I'm sorry, next slide, please. The third change relates to correction in how the coke oven gas standard is calculated. Before discussing the change, I think it would be helpful if I just provide a little bit of background on that standard. So as I mentioned earlier, coke oven gas is produced during the coking process and contains sulfur compounds, and hydrogen sulfide is one of the more commonly ones that are of those sulfur compounds in the gas. Now, Article 21 limits the concentration of sulfur compounds in the coke oven gas when flared or combusted. And as I mentioned, the gas is burned to heat the coke ovens and boilers and so forth. Now that standard is based on what's referred to as grains of sulfur compounds in a volume of coke oven gas. And as this picture shows, a grain is a unit of measurement of mass and it weighs about the same amount as a grain of wheat or barley. Next slide, please. So Article 21 the current Article 21 includes 2 grain limits for sulfur compounds based on when the battery is installed. Listed under each of those boxes, are standards. In the standards are the U.S. Steel coke oven batteries subject to that standard. Now, batteries installed prior to 1978 are required to meet a 50 grain standard, and batteries after 1978 are required to meet a 10 grain standard. Now, instead of testing each individual coke battery to determine compliance with either the 10 or 50 standard, the current regulations allow U.S. Steel to test after the coke oven gas from each battery is combined and provides for a plant-wide standard of 40 grains. Now, the issue is that when you calculate a plant-wide standard based on each battery's capacity and applying that 10 or 50 grain standard based on the age of the battery, it does not equal 40 grains. Now, it's our understanding that the 40 grain standard was based on some negotiated standard agreed upon years ago and is our position is not the correct calculated standard based on the 10 to 50 grains. Next slide, please. Now, I want to also note that this isn't something that's not directly in the regulation, but currently it's important to note that battery C, which is the most recent battery at U.S. Steel, it was installed in 2013 after the 40 grain standard was set in Article 21. Now, based on battery C being subject to the 10 grain standard, U.S. Steel's plant-wide limit was lowered to 35 grains in its permit. So it's currently permitted to require 35 grains. Again, the 35 grain standard was not correctly calculated based on the 10 and 50 grain standard. Next slide, please. Now, during our regulation review process, our air quality engineers recalculated and determined that the correct grain standard should be 23 grains. I want to note that the proposed regulation is allowing U.S. Steel until January 1, 2025 to come in compliance with this correct coke oven gas standard. Next slide, please. Now, this is a table that details the ACHD's calculation for the grain standard. A copy of this is also in the technical support document if you'd like to review that. Next slide, please. Now, as I noted earlier, the coke oven gas contains sulfur compounds, and this chart illustration kind of depicts this. So when the sulfur compounds are combusted to either heat the coke ovens, boilers, or blast furnaces, the sulfur compounds become sulfur dioxide, which is one of 6 air pollutants regulated by the EPA under the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. Next slide, please. Now, the only sulfur compound that the regulations currently require to be measured is hydrogen sulfide for determining compliance with the grain standard. As I noted earlier, during this process, we reviewed the PA Department of Environmental Protection's regulations. Now, the DEP regulations require the measurement of all sulfur compounds and not just hydrogen sulfide. Now, again, because our regulations are less stringent, the ACHD is proposing to require the measurement of additional sulfur compounds. Next slide, please. Now, during this process, we obtained data from US Steel, which provided information as to which sulfur compounds are in the coke oven gas. The sulfur compounds that are listed here comprise an appreciable amount of the total sulfur compounds in the coke oven gas. Now, in the regulation that we're proposing, we identify these compounds under the definition of measured sulfur compounds. The measurement of these sulfur compounds will be used to determine compliance with the revised 23 grains standard. Now, Dean will now discuss in more detail some of the specific regulation changes. Thank you.
Next slide, please. You're going to see this diagram a couple times going through. It's the same diagram, just focusing on different portions of the process. So the first one here is the charging emissions, which, as Jeff mentioned, is the beginning of the coking process. Throughout that coking process, whenever the coal is turning into coke, gases are created. They're collected at the collector main and then sent down to the byproduct recovery plant. And then during the cooking process, you can have emissions come out of multiple portions of the plant, multiple portions of the battery. And then the inspectors are conducting inspections on or around the battery during these times. So for example, here on the charging inspection, the inspectors are on top of the battery, observing the coal introduction into the ovens, and then measuring the opacity, the time of opacity from that. Next slide, please. So a couple of things here is the couple of the changes. And again, we're just focusing on some of them, not all the changes. Your packet has more of those in it. But so adding or fewer is doing that to not constrain the inspectors. The way it's currently written in the regulation, it's 5 charges for 55 seconds combined or 4 charges for 75 seconds combined, depending upon which battery it is. The issue with that is sometimes it can take many hours for the inspector to conduct those inspections. It has to be all 5 of them. We're adding the or fewer in here. So for example, if the second charge, it makes it non-compliant inspection, the inspectors can then stop that inspection and then move on to conduct other inspections instead of basically adding no value, continuing that time frame doing charging. The second point is about the location. This is a point of disagreement between ACHD and US Steel, where we're proposing to have a view of any of the charging emissions, while US Steel wants to have an unobstructed view of the whole charge. So it's just a difference of it. Again, certain points of the regulation changes, and then the entire regulation that you have with the strikeouts, additions, the TSD, that's all found in your packet of information. Next slide, please. And then onto the door emissions. There's a door on each side of each oven going down the entire length of the battery. And then these door emissions can occur during the coking process. Whenever they remove those doors prior to the push, some emissions can come out of there at that point too. But the focal point here is whenever the doors are closed and the gases could be potentially volatilized and exit out the door portion. Next slide, please. So the big focal point on this one is the removal of the 2-door exclusion. And this was done because the federal regulations don't allow any door leaks. The way our current regulations are, you're allowed to have 2 door leaks. So for example, if you have a battery with 100 doors total and there's 11 leaks, the way our regulations currently are written up is you can subtract up to 2 of those. And then the federal rules don't have any subtraction for that. So Federal rules, those 11 leaks remain at 11 leaks, while ours potentially could be decreased down to 9. The proposal here, again for public comment, is to not remove those two-door exclusions, so the 11 leaks would count as 11 leaks as the federal rule is. Next slide, please. Offtake piping. This is one of the ones involving the consent agreement that we had with U.S. Steel and the objection about record keeping. One of the things that we had put in here, this diagram to the right, since it won't be clear to many of you, is a portion of the inspection that the inspectors record for offtake piping. So the regulation says that we have to have leaks. It doesn't specify as to where those leaks originate from. But what we did is we changed the form after discussions with U.S. Steel. This is prior to the reg change at this point, but which portion of the operation the leaks are originating from. So we changed that on our inspection form, but not in the regulation, because for the regulatory purposes, it doesn't matter where the leak's originating, like cap, flange joint, any of those things. It just matters whether or not there's a leak. So we didn't propose that change in the regulation, but again, we did change it on the inspection form. Next slide, please. And then onto the pushing portion of the operation. The pushing is whenever the coking process has been completed, and then they're looking to remove that coke, send it down the quench tower Jeff mentioned, and eventually onto the customer. So you have the pusher ram coming across. During this part, there's inspections that are being conducted, and they can look at this from either the top of the battery or the ground to try and observe the opacity. And again, opacity is essentially how much your view is hindered by smoke or by emissions in this case. So our impression, sorry, next slide. So we added a paragraph in there directly from the state regulations because those regulations had applied, but we're trying to put it in here for clarity. And then the objection is about positioning, as I was trying to get into on the wrong slide there. The positioning, U.S. Steel has an objection about the position where they feel that we should be observing from the ground, and our inspectors feel that they can get a clear and objective view from the top of the battery or the ground. Sometimes the sun direction dictates also, because whenever you're recording opacity, you have to meet certain conditions, and sun angle is one of them. So you cannot be looking directly into the sun. So occasionally you may not be able to read from the ground, so you would have to read from the top. And then the inspectors also do have some concerns about reading from the ground, because there's different things, different construction, obstructions which could be in the way. So the regulation as proposed for public comment is that it would give the inspectors the choice, basically, wherever they can do it, whatever they can observe, meet the methods required, and record accurate opacity, that's what they would be able to do. Next slide, please. And then this goes into the same slide from earlier from Jeff for the sulfur compounds in the coke oven gas. Next slide. So Jeff went into the details on it, but yeah, we believe the 40 grain limit was incorrectly calculated, and that 40 grain limit led to the 35 grain limit, which is currently in Battery C's installation permit. We do feel that 23 is the correct calculation. And again, that date would be January 1, 2025, so there's a few years there. The measured sulfur compounds, Jeff went into more of the specifics on which one of them. It's going to be 6 separate sulfur compounds, which would cover the vast majority of the potential sulfur compounds. It's not going to cover every single one of them, but it'll cover the vast majority of them. And then as expressed as equivalent, this gets a little bit more into the weeds, but we changed that wording there for expressing as equivalent hydrogen sulfide, again, to match the state regulations, because ours was less stringent than theirs. The other part is the hourly basis. The regulation, it wasn't defined before. There was no term. It could be instantaneous or anything else. So we defined this term as an hourly basis. And that's because they have frequent, basically short-term fluctuations in the gas flow, the sulfur content, which could change it on instantaneous levels. So we made it on an hourly basis as proposed. Next slide, please. The one problem with this diagram is it doesn't really have good drawings of the offtakes, which are located on the outside of each of the batteries, which is where the soaking emissions originate. So I was just trying to highlight, if you look at the little angle, that's probably the closest one, but don't worry about the picture too much. Basically, the soaking emissions occur from the outside of each oven. Next slide, please. Which is where this section comes into play. So the 2-minute exclusion, this is a clarification that we were putting into the regulation as proposed, because U.S. Steel had a concern about recording the standpipe cap opening. the way the regulation reads is that currently is that there's a 2-minute exclusion. I'll read it verbatim. An exclusion from this opacity limit shall be allowed for 2 minutes after a standpipe cap is opened. So that's the way the regulation currently is read. The issue that we're running into is that US Steel doesn't record the standpipe opening. So after discussions, we proposed it with a clarification as it's written in your packet, where they would have to do certain measures during that 2-minute exclusionary period. It still does apply. However, if the inspectors are up there and they observe an opened standpipe cap and they did not observe it opened, it would be on US Steel to tell us when it was opened. And what that does is the regulation still stands as it's written, like I said, 2 minutes after it's open. It just puts the onus a little bit on US Steel to actually record that standpipe opening and tell us when it was. Because the inspectors, if they're going up there and they don't know if the standpipe has been open for 0, 15 minutes. So it's a way to try and make sure that we're consistently actually enforcing what the regulation is written as. Next slide, please. Miscellaneous topics. This is another paragraph which came over directly from the Pennsylvania DEP regulation, Department of Environmental Protection. Just being brought into here because it's a regulation that applied, which we didn't have in ours for consistency and clarity. Next slide, please. Inspections. This is an additional section that does not apply specifically to coke ovens. It applies to every facility in a county. It's basically there so that sources would not operate differently whenever they're not being inspected in relation to air quality. So if there's an inspection occurring, for example, and there's 5 people in a certain area, whenever under normal operations, there's only going to be 1 or 2 people in that area, it's likely to lead to higher emissions whenever inspections are not occurring. And the idea of this is so that the sources will operate environmentally at all times as opposed to just when inspections are occurring. So they wouldn't be modifying procedures whenever we're on site. Next slide, please. These are a few of the considerations which we did not put into the regulation change, and some of them have been gone into earlier. The EPA method 203C, that's an Environmental Protection Agency method, federal method for averaging emissions of opacity for instantaneous limits. We did not incorporate this into our regulations. We feel it's less stringent than what our current one is. It's also very difficult for the inspectors to conduct the actual inspections and record it accurately. So there's some difficulty on them actually being able to do the recording for this method. So that's one of the, without going into too much detail, and if you have any questions, please do ask. But it's about, basically this one requires averaging for instantaneous limits, and we didn't incorporate it because it's less stringent. Another one is the walking pace. This is a EPA, again, method 303, which is a requirement for all coke oven batteries in the country to follow. And they have specific procedures under method 303. Method 303 has different procedures than Allegheny County does. And the walking pace is one of the ones from 303 that we did not want to include because we felt that it would constrain the inspectors too much. It's basically specific paces that the inspectors would have to do conducting their inspections. And there's variability. There's a lot of variability on coke batteries. And having that walking pace specifically in the regulation may hinder them actually being able to conduct those inspections accurately. So we didn't want to put that one into there. And then kind of reference just in the last bullet, but the third one there is that we didn't incorporate everything from method 303 methods, but we did adopt them when we felt it was appropriate to do so. Next slide. And then at this point, we're just requesting the Board of Health to send these amendments for a 60-day public comment period. Anybody else have any questions? That's the final slide we have.
Thanks for those really clear presentations.